I think it's very safe to say that Marvel's dominance is over, where after a couple years of mediocre crap, people have just become very tired of the MCU, only satisfied with Endgame and a couple shows after like Spider-Man along the way. Because for some reason, they haven't seemed to really know what to do or plan when it comes to their next generations of storytelling and superheroes, stuff we've already told multiple times at this point, but has become much more evident with the release of films like The Marvels. And The Marvels is definitely the worst the MCU has to offer at this point, more than we could ever realize when the teaser showed over the course of this year. It represents the culmination of crap that has been shoved down the pipeline and changes nothing over the course of the current leadership that has been going off, where nowadays we really must question what is happening with those in charge like Kevin Feige and those around him, where most people applaud him for his efforts at Marvel for well over a decade now with what he guided towards Endgame, but now see that time is obviously up and instead made for the worse. And this is something I don't really understand when shows like Loki Season 2 during the same time frame actually were quite good in my opinion. I do have some issues with the show, but not to the extent with most other Marvel productions, and especially the one I just watched, where I could gladly say is much more worse than Ant-Man. I mean, I'm not actually glad to say it because it just doesn't work at all, and even surprised they tried to release this in the state it's in, where it's like they haven't learned anything over the course of this year, even if it was produced the year prior to everything from the strikes to the box office bombs that actually happened in 2023. And in seeing this, I just really couldn't think of a better way to showcase the true problems of the Walt Disney Company itself than from here. The point where I just feel sorry to make these videos after that downfall, thinking I could cover what I actually wanted back then, but then when stuff like this shows up, it just becomes more harder to ignore, as I have done for the most part with other films in Marvel trying to combine them in singular topics. And if any of the reports are to go by but the plans to either replace Kang or try to salvage what they can to retain some sort of consistency, then I really think it would sink it even further, because they have honestly done nothing to actually earn that right after they tried to stick to a plan of the multiverse itself. A plan that works the best in shows like Loki that still knows what it wants and still had a conclusive ending compared to the rest, where if they abandon that idea now, then it will ruin everything that is involved with this, a point where just people are confused what is the actual purpose of these types of shows and movies that are going along the production line. And this is a video that's going to be half review of the film itself, mainly discussing the true problem that will result out of this situation, as the numbers are not looking quite good at all. Some seeing it as a victory of the go woke go broke crowd that many channels like to actually produce, and others who are just disappointed that things they fall in love with like this itself are not given a proper chance. A standard we expect in today's discourse and the insistence of companies shoving crap constantly that results in their ultimate failings that we see now. The failings of the institutions that can perform for the better but likes to stick to the side of the worse. Because The Marvels is a film that represents the biggest problem that plagues Disney to date. A convoluted mess that is unwilling to change no matter how many times they try to say it is. It is more inconsistent to how characters were originally formed and has no identity to what the story should be focused on. Instead of a sequel to Captain Marvel, it feels more like the standard sequel to a Disney Plus show like Miss Marvel. One that I hardly remember for the most at this point, where it wasn't necessarily bad at all, but just bloated like the rest to do something for the perceived future of Marvel movies. Because after all, when you actually look down to it and ignore the actual lore of the universe, two of the main characters of this film alongside Captain Marvel herself were actually introduced in the Disney Plus shows. Their main stories and notoriety actually came and derived from there, rather than a general audience perspective that we know in movies for the most part with Marvel. And even though plenty might actually throw around the notion that Disney Plus is hard to actually follow for a general movie audience, or the fact that it is one of the biggest streaming services out there where plenty of people could see it, it still just creates little development in the way of their stories. Having to focus on three individuals quickly shoved and intertwined with each other and then face them against a new threat that was never actually introduced till up until this point. A lazy form of storytelling that provides no actual place to go when it actually could have with the potential that it's shown. The same thing happening with other minor characters in the story like Nick Fury, where this story actually does take place after the events of shows like Secret Invasion, which was more darker in tone until the very end of whatever that was and contradicts that very character very hard, or just the complete character of Nick Fury himself that we come to know in the MCU, making things like those Disney Plus series irrelevant and inconsequential to what was being added. Series and films like Secret Invasion and The Marvels hardly give any respect to what they actually built previously by knocking all of those events down in so many ways and the lore that they actually built up. Remembering at this point that they just threw away characters like Maria Hill away in the first episode, where now we just walk that event off like it was nothing and kick the comedy back into full gear and even worse than Thor Love and Thunder. To its credit, it does want to be a fun adventure banter and excels on that when they actually focus on it, but also wants to go into different directions to at least connect with its audience, which then creates a mixed bag of ideas that don't make sense either. And I really don't get it when the cast can really actually deliver on those points. Whereas many people have already said before, Iman Vellani is truly the best part of this very film in that very role. One who really does care about this universe and the character, and it really shows, giving such needed personality that the film should have had it actually stuck the landing with what was intended from its leadership. But leadership is something that you would never find in this film itself, not displayed much by Captain Marvel herself or just anyone involved in making this at all, just much like the leadership of Marvel, Lucasfilm, Disney, whatever. Because how can you really connect with these characters if only one is actually making it worthwhile? Monica and Carol just seem so stale to what is being delivered or given the roles that they were designed within the confines of their story, instead doing the same exact problem that movies like Multiverse of Madness actually falls into, being short of its actual potential, where the writing was just literally on the wall for a movie like this to become a horrible disappointment. Everything this story is doing is just taking what Marvel has had for granted, treating it as a product as Disney has demonstrated so many times before for most of their other properties. Because what purpose does it serve for a viewer if they don't get what's going on? Like what was being matched up before or after. The only thing I could really say that this movie actually does a good job of, in my opinion, is bouncing back and forth, from the very power switching back and forth to the plot itself with its comedy and semi-serious conversations our main characters have in some way that is supposed to have some sort of emotional payoff. And this doesn't mean everyone is going to agree with these sentiments, because there are plenty of people, especially kids, who will have a good time with movies like this and not expect it to be bad as what others have been saying over the course of the few days. Just the same typical standard fun popcorn movie that you're used to if you ignore the overall problems that the MCU actually has. But just looking at it from that perspective, and of course the story itself, is one that just refuses to acknowledge or understand anything that built it up from the first place. And in terms of speaking of building, that's something that Bob Iger actually said that Disney is supposed to be in right now with the state after what has happened over the course of the year. Something that I don't really believe in at all with what has been going on, especially with this release. I mean, I do think some areas would actually be better, as I have stated with Pixar and Inside Out, but everything else just doesn't seem to want to change for the better, as they have just delayed their big films that no one wants to watch, like Snow White and Mufasa, the remake films that aren't cancelled at all and still moving forward, unwilling to change for the better with the criticism people have had mocking towards them. And this film itself is just all the proof we need that what they all say is actually false. They want the comedy that doesn't land for the most part of the films, and they want the story that isn't even there. I used to sing all the praises of what Disney Plus could do, but somehow it still has hampered their ability to perform with movies like this. It doesn't mean it's bad or it dilutes it with its potential, but more the fact that they don't care enough to actually make it work. They are too lazy to actually care for the actual proper development like they've done before with 2 movies per year. They don't want to be the old MCU now with the resources they have, or just make things actually work or conclusive as Loki because they feel like they don't need to at all. You can see this with the shorter runtime this movie has compared to the works of their past like Endgame. Granted, that was still the conclusion and needed the most time to finish off their main characters, but it's still very stunning that newer films like the Marvels released at the tail end of this year have become the shortest instead. Because when you expect or have more than one main comic book hero or character in general, then you'd think they would usually have more time for them to explore them more beyond the longer series. Especially disappointing when some of the cast were actually highly anticipated coming into it and then turning out to only have 5 minutes of screen time or less and go nowhere as characters. Questioning if it was just cameo fan service as many people adore them outside of these films, or just cutting down the story as something that didn't work with their direction. The latter of which seems more likely to me, as it was actually significantly cut down for something at the very least. But either one just seems worse because it doesn't add anything meaningful to what should be added. There should be more of a reason to expect them in these films other than just fan service at this point, because it adds nothing to what the story should go or what it should actually mean instead of being a product. And because of that, it just feels more appropriate as a Disney Plus series instead because of its tone and the plot they actually wanted to go for. Better fit for something like Miss Marvel Season 2 or whatever they were going with, as its ending, without giving any spoilers, matches the characters they already have in that realm, being once again introduced in these very shows to begin with and then shoved on screen with Captain Marvel, where the ideas they have for the main plot and conflict could have better served as another solo story to flesh her out as a character with the very villain that somehow matched what was being started in the last film and what happened or something like that. There's just nothing nothing happening for them except the same problems we have constantly provided throughout, still trying to push through them more without any time or proper care. That there is a more evident focus on the idea of the character providing the merchandise, just selling them as much as they can, and not a complete group of stories that can lead to a greater purpose, or glorious purpose might I say. And of course, it just wasn't coming easy off the back of Captain Marvel, which wasn't a great film either, but it was explosive box office success in the time between Infinity War and Endgame. Not the worst thing they have ever produced, but still just an okay story at the most that could have been benefited being explored a bit better, which films like this could have done, but just rushed after the state we found ourselves with these movies in phases 4 and 5 of Marvel. Once again, doing little with that multiverse concept, making it an excuse to shove in newer characters without intertwining a broader interconnecting narrative. Forgetting stuff of the entire worlds they built, like the Celestial popping out of the ocean or Nick Fury here, and disregarding Secret Invasion. It just doesn't feel like anyone cares anymore with all the Skrulls that were involved in that plot, making people distrust each other on Earth, and then seeing Carol again in this film helping them out or whatever. Like I said, I only briefly watched or cared about the events of Secret Invasion, but it still feels more inconsistent to what is actually being told. The fans of things and series like that are not actually being treated well with any respect when you give them something that can contradict that very point. Like, what is the vision anymore for characters like Nick Fury if you're just willing to actually betray any sense of purpose they've had anymore? Who is really in charge of what runs Marvel Studios anymore from the point it used to be? Because it feels like you are no longer wanting to stick to any idea at all, using it sparingly here and there and forgetting what rules you set to establish it with. Turning threats into a parody of itself in this film, like Spaceballs if you know what I mean, if you've seen this movie, that really sucks the air out of the entire room. And I just want to remind everyone that I don't take pleasure in seeing this happen because of how much I actually enjoyed the MCU in the past, and of course being a Disney fan as a whole, knowing what I used to be. How they no longer care about what legacy they were actually carrying over time, and how that is just exploited to whatever view they can actually find fit. The very talk I said that vindicates people of certain opinions who think people like Brie Larson or the idea of the MCU now is just woke or whatever. Really wanted to mention this because I know they do not care at all and only thrive off the negativity of Disney rather than actually wanting to change it for the better. A point I know that some of you know who I'm talking about exactly right here. It's just unproductive to anything because they only speak out of it as low-rate news articles for 5 minutes that the algorithm eats a lot, as I have come to know that negativity does get clicks and do whatever it takes to actually preserve them, even if there are positives to that very situation, that they could turn to a negative as that could actually easily fit their narrative. Some actually do point out the real problems that they have still had overall, but with what the internet provides, it actually just turns it into a negative as long as they can actually perceive it as a win to their argument against the big bad Disney, even if they have plenty of people who produce quality under executive scrunch. In a nutshell, it's a scaling problem that showcases the limits of what they can do. You can't just do it anymore and expect massive results because we don't need to be shoved down our throats constantly with the excessiveness and disregard for such characters or writing. No room to actually go or grow in between for those who actually love the movie, who disagree with us and actually write us off as not giving it a chance, and then those who clearly just profit out of rage. A balance in between where we need to find just criticism because we want them to succeed. It's how I just want them to do better for us even at their lowest points, because they do have the potential to showcase us, but just choose not to with the fact that they don't even want to. Perpetuating this constant cycle of unchanging stagnation, having a series try to lead up to a movie only for that movie to hint at something bigger to begin with another cycle beginning all over again and not changing. Having people spend money on things that go nowhere at all. A combination of things completely in their control that they could change for the better, and others without, like the deaths of some actors where they cannot actually find themselves the courage to actually move on. As other characters like Luke Skywalker once said, their overconfidence is truly their weakness, relying on the basic safe formula that has dragged them to this point when they know damn well that's not why they are here in the first place, but just choose to do so even when things go wrong. Persistent to still shove out more remakes, more basic Marvel films, and of course Star Wars films, even though evidence and data points to something else. We can have and deserve to have the amount of diverse stories that they have pushed out, but not to the lazy effort they have shoved in older stories, or just do the bare minimum for newer ones that makes it more clear that what they have planned cannot continue at all unless they are bent on destroying themselves with the goodwill they have. And when Disney sees overall results like this movie at the box office and its critical reception, then they better hope to actually change right this very minute before it becomes too late. Because as of this moment, Marvel and the MCU have officially finished telling their complete story, and it's just time to move on for something better. Until the next movie actually does come out and the cycle still continues, of course. But with all of that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.